Hello, good afternoon. Maybe when you look at the colours, what you see is round the other way from the way I see it. Maybe when you look at red, the sensation you have is the same as the sensation I get when I look at something green. Maybe all the colours you see are systematically round the other way from the way I see them. We'll look at this possibility. How many of you have thought of this already? Yeah, there's something about philosophy classes. People tend to come into this when they've been troubled by this kind of thing since they were 12. But we'll talk about that kind of scenario and what it means on Monday, looking at Martina Nida Rumeland's paper, Pseudo-Normal Vision. Today we're going to look at the possibility of something that's functionally just like you or me, but it's not that there are sensations around the other way. They don't have any sensations at all. But first of all, let's just say something about how we got to where we are. Last time we were talking about variable realizability. Variable realizability? Variable realizability. The idea that given a particular mind with a particular set of psychological possibilities open to it, you could have exactly the same kind of mind but made out of different stuff. Our minds are made out of carbon. You could have the very same kinds of mind made out of a different stuff, made out of silicon. And we get this the whole time when we're thinking about science fiction possibilities. It really seems to be real when you're thinking about other animals, our old friend the octopus, and even in a single individual over time. Some parts of your brain might take over the function that other parts had. What used to be doing the work of vision might come to be doing some of the work of hearing. So it seems kind of obviously possible that you could make a mind out of different kinds of stuff. But what does that tell us about what we're going to say mental states actually are? There's something about the whole project of saying what mental states actually are, what the feeling of pain is, that is, I don't quite know how to put this, it's somehow intrinsically mind-bending. So imagine the top of your head was cut off and you had a mirror on a stick so you could look at your brain. And then you look around you and you say, look, all these sensations, all these experiences that I'm having right now, that's all there. That's the same thing. It's a really natural idea. How could that be? That makes no sense. In office hours this morning, I was talking to different people and getting the same reaction to, once you get what the behaviorist is saying, the behaviorist is not saying pain causes behavior or pain accompanies behavior. The behaviorist is saying the pain actually is the behavior. That seems crazy. How could anyone think that? Or the functionalist says not that pain has a particular kind of functional structure, but that being in pain just is having this functional structure. How could that be? It makes no sense whatever. I mean, I think when you think about what's surprising about that, it's kind of as if you're told, here's the pain, it's this fiber firing here, something in the mirror, and you think, well, how could that be? I suppose that down from the Maths Institute, people said, look, we've made a fundamental breakthrough. Here we have the number 9. It turns out to be a small rock. Here it is. Duplicates are available. And they say this is a great breakthrough. We have a team working on 7. Anyone's reaction is, how could that be? I mean, your natural reaction is, well, I'm sure the maths is just great, but that can't be right. The number 9 just couldn't be a small, could it? I don't know, things move so fast these days. You guys seem pretty unastonished. But I think it couldn't be a small, is that right? Is this a generation thing? How could the number 9 be a small rock? Could it? Could it? If some distinguished mathematician swept down from the Maths Institute and said, here we have it, it's been located at last. Your natural thought is that just doesn't make any sense at all. And I think with saying a mental state is C fiber firing or a mental state is a functional structure, you have the same natural reaction. That just couldn't be what it is. That makes no sense. That's why dualism is appealing, because you don't know what ectoplasm is, and you think, well, whatever it is, it doesn't... Since I don't know what ectoplasm is, I can't be astonished by the news that pain is made of ectoplasm. Pain is a configuration of ectoplasm. Since you don't know what ectoplasm is, you couldn't be confused by the message that the number 9 was a bit of ectoplasm. I mean, since you have no idea what ectoplasm is, well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. But whenever you get something where you know what it is, the question, how could that be the feeling of pain? How could that be a feeling of sorrow? Is really puzzling, right? It really has that dumbfounding reaction, but that's a crazy idea. And one way of seeing the appeal of functionalism is that it tries to explain how you can make sense of this kind of identity. It says any mental state has a particular characteristic set of causes and effects. Take the feeling of sorrow. You can say what causes it. You've got some tragic event in your life, something bad happens. You pay attention to that bad thing. Okay, this is not terribly hard to do, right? You can just spell this out. What happens when you're feeling sorrow? Someone you love has died. What happens next? You ruminate, you go over and over it. Other emotions come into play. As Yoda said, grief. Grief leads to anger. Anger leads to suffering. You know how that kind of thing goes. And then these feed back and generate further sorrow. And then, once you know what that functional structure of sorrow is, you can look and say, well, what in the objective world has that functional structure? And if it turns out it's a brain state there, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's the brain state that is a feeling of sorrow. That would make sense of saying the feeling of sorrow was an electrochemical discharge. Or if you're impressed by variable realizability, you can go on and say, well, actually, any state that has that functional structure will count as sorrow. And I said that kind of functionalism actually is science's philosophy of mind. Scientists studying the mind are in the business of breaking down the brain into its components and then giving you a box and arrow diagram of how all those components are related and what they're doing. That's what the scientific study of the mind is. I guess I just said sorrow leads to all this other stuff. Sorrow leads to rumination, further emotion, back to sorrow. How do you know that's true? How do you know what the functional role of a psychological state is? Do you know what the functional role of a psychological state is? No idea? Sorrow leads to joy. Great good news makes you sorrowful. Is this another generation thing? That can't be right. You just start out commonsensically and you can say what the structure of sorrow is. I mean, you don't really know what sorrow is unless you've understood that bit of the functional role. Or you might say, no, it's up to science. Science doesn't just generate the box and arrow diagrams. Science can look into what causes people to... I mean, after all, there is a whole science of happiness. Scientists studying what causes people to feel happy, what the effects of happiness are. Is it good for the economy, and so on. But there are actually a number of different answers you could give here. One is, when you just learn the meaning of the word sorrow, you know what its functional structure is. But it's also possible that when you think about why it's important to us, just in ordinary life, to know about phenomena like joy or grief or sorrow, it doesn't matter so that you can draw box and arrow diagrams of them. I mean, who cares about drawing box and arrow diagrams? What's really important is how in practice you interact with other people. Someone said of a friend of mine, he just doesn't know how to behave around people. And you know what that means, how you can behave around people, how you react to someone's sorrow. You might actually show in the way you react to them that you have a really good, sophisticated, rich understanding of what the functional structure is. But it might be that when you come to spell it out, you're not very good at spelling it out. Just as you might be able to tie your shoelaces, and you might be a real whiz at tying your shoelaces, but when you come to write down how you tie your shoelaces, you don't do it too good. But you could be great in practice at interacting with other people, but just go wrong when you try to make that articulate. So one picture of what's going on when we have this kind of diagram is that this is stuff we all know in practice. This is like tying your shoelaces. But when you try and write it down, you can make mistakes that you wouldn't actually in real life, in practice. Okay, so much for functionalism, how we got there and what it's doing. Does that make sense? Does it seem like a crazy view? Do we understand what the view is? Actually, put your hand up if you're comfortable with what functionalism is at this point. Higher. Right. And if you're not comfortable with what functionalism is? Whoa. Okay, right. Let's pause for a second. Okay. Well, what about electrical circuits? What about the concept of a switch in an electrical circuit? Is that put up your hand if you're comfortable with the idea that the concept of a switch in an electrical circuit is a functional idea. And if you're not comfortable with that, higher? Okay, good, right. Okay, so the concept of a switch is a little bit abstract. It's defined by its inputs and outputs. Yeah? What about the idea of a mood, like being grumpy? Can't that be functional? I mean, being in a mood like being grumpy, that's just a matter of how you're going to react when people approach you. And is there any more to being grumpy than that? If someone asks you for a favor, then you'll be more inclined to help them. Yeah? Yes?
So what's the difference between that example and a behaviorist approach?
So far there is no difference. Behaviorism you can think of as a kind of functionalism. Yeah? You've got you have some state that is making you behave in a certain way in response to certain inputs. Yeah. Okay. I'll come on to the difference in a second, but yeah.
But you can be grumpy and not react.
You can be grumpy and not react.
Not produce that behavior.
And not produce that behavior. Is that right? Sorry?
Like the super Spartan.
I could be a super Spartan about grumpiness. I'm sorry. That's wonderful. They've been bred for generations and generations never to show the least sign of being grumpy. And so now they never have any inclination even to react badly when someone... This is a great example. I wish I'd thought of that. Next year's class will get that example. So for generations and generations, they've been bred not to be grumpy, so that now, when the things that would usually make us grumpy happen to them, they don't have the slightest tendency to react badly. Is that right? That would be the idea? Yeah. Okay, what's the difference between that and a scenario where grumpiness has just been bred out of them? I mean, that's what you're describing, really. You're not describing a situation in which there's grumpiness there. There's no vestige of grumpiness in these people. Yeah? You really just rigorously described a case in which grumpiness has been systematically flushed out of them, and not a trace of it remains. Yeah? There is no more to the grumpiness than those functional connections. What would be the difference between a super Spartan who was grumpy and one who wasn't? No difference at all. Isn't that right? Put up your hand if you think that sounds completely right. I'm completely knocked out by that. Uh-huh. Put up your hand if you think I have no idea what you're talking about at the moment. Uh-huh. Okay. And if you think you disagree, you can make sense of super Spartans about grumpiness. Okay. Would you like to?
I have a question.
Yep.
I feel like there's a difference between grumpiness being bred out of you and you actually being grumpy, but faking that you're not.
Yeah.
If I was actually something pissed me off and I was upset about it, and I but still had to fake a smile and be happy.
That's
I'm
right.
still internally grumpy even though I'm not displaying the characteristic. So I guess that's where I don't understand.
The state you're describing of faking it, that makes perfect sense. All I'd say about that is, we well know, that is a complex state, right? If you get pushed too far in that state, you might explode much worse than you would have if you haven't been faking it. And in general, the sheer mental pressure of faking it might mean that you can't do long division the way you usually can, or you don't drive so good. You see what I mean? If you're in a car and faking it, you really might go off the bridge under the pressure of the situation. Yeah, it will show up in other ways. Yeah, but these super Spartans have got none of that. They don't need to fake it. They don't have the slightest impulse to engage in the behavior. So why would they fake it? Yeah, yeah.
So you're basically saying that because they're not, grumpiness is only seen by how you interact with other people.
Exactly.
But my question is then, say that I'm feeling grumpy, but you lock me in a closet. Well, when I'm sitting, not interacting with anyone, but in my head, do I think that I'm grumpy or am I not grumpy because I can't show it? Because I think that you would still feel grumpy even if you're by yourself. You just have a grumpy outlook on life.
You can try this at home. I think you're right. I mean, I would feel even more grumpy if I was in the closet, right? But if you think about what is going on there, your potential for interacting with other people is very different than it would be if you weren't grumpy. Yeah? I mean, anyone with any sense is not going to let you be the one who lets you out of the closet. You see what I mean? Because they know what the upshot will be. In fact, that the way you're the way you're poised to interact with other people might be the very reason you got put into the cupboard in the first place, right? If you're particularly grumpy, yeah. I'm just hypothesizing.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's a science condition.
Yeah. That's right. Well, I mean, what's right and good about your example is that there's no real interaction with other people going on here. Yeah, that is absolutely right. But look, if you just think about what you need to interact with other people, if we didn't have terms that told us how other people were likely to behave in a whole bunch of different scenarios, we would want to have them. If you want to know whether to ask your boss for a raise, You want to know something about how they're likely to react when you do that. Yeah? If you want to know, is this a good time to give your friend bad news? You want to know something about how they're likely to react when you do that. We need words that tell us what the inputs and output, what output we're likely to get for any given input with a particular person. This is part of being a social creature. Just as if you're going to interact with an electrical system, you need some concept of things like switches and lamps so that you can know how the circuits are organized. Doesn't that make sense? If we didn't have functional terms for interacting with other people socially, we would need to invent them. But the idea is that's what psychological terms are. That's what all these words for mental states are. We are very, very complex. Grumpy is just the tip of the iceberg in how complex we are. We have these rich internal structures, but they're all just defined as internal structures. Yep?
So if, like, say, a baby was raised for its entire life in solitary confinement,
Yeah.
would that person have no mental states since they have no social interaction?
No, if you're thinking that would be the wrong answer, then I just agree. But if they didn't have any concept of how to interact with other people, then they wouldn't have mental state. Then they wouldn't have the concept of mental states. Yep. An animal can exist on its own without. It might not be a social animal. It might never meaningfully interact with other animals, but still have a lot of psychological states. It just doesn't think about them. Yeah. If you or I or your person raised in solitude are going to think about psychological states, they have to be thinking about potential interactions. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Yep.
So when you're talking about the social inputs and outputs, like asking your boss for a raise or like telling your friends, like picking a good time to tell your friends
Yeah.
bad news, is it the fact that we can kind of guess their outputs? Wouldn't that be because we have an imaginative kind of understanding of them and like where they are at that certain point and what they're doing and
That's right.
when would be the best time of the day to tell them because we can kind of understand their situations and how they'll react, not just like something without thought, just like a machine working this way.
That's great. That is true and insightful. That's exactly how we do know about other people, by getting an imaginative understanding of them. But it's one thing just to have the imaginative understanding of another person, and another thing to be able to say what kind of state they're in. You see what I mean? You get people like that who are not that articulate, but just very good around people. They will say to you, don't talk to him right now, do it later. And if you ask why, they just say, no, do it later. You see what I mean? And what I'm talking about is being able to say what's going on with this person. That's when you're actually using the psychological concepts and using the functional notions. And what you're doing when you're imagining them on this functionalist approach is getting an intuitive understanding of what kind of functional state they're in, how they're likely to respond to any particular stimulus. And then articulating that is a matter of using the symbols, as you might use a switch symbol. Or somebody might be you could get an electrician who's very good at actually interacting with the machinery in a room, but not that great at articulating what it all is. Yeah. But nonetheless, what they're doing when they articulate what's going on here is they're describing the thing functionally.
So maybe when you're trying to pick the best time to tell your friends bad news, you're thinking about the input of what you're saying, but also the input of everything that's happening in their surroundings.
Exactly. That whole complex in there from their past context, their current functional structure, and what the response in there is going to be to your input. Yeah.
So maybe it could kind of be a combination of like imaginative understanding and just like knowing A plus B equals whatever.
Yeah. What I was suggesting was you're getting that A plus B knowledge from your imaginative understanding. That's the basis. It's because you have the imaginative understanding that you can do that. Yeah. And that is the reason I say that's insightful is it's something deep that is special about the case of the mind. An electrician looking at a wiring system can interact with it perfectly well, but it's not like the electrician has to become one with the electrical system or get some imaginative understanding of the electrical system from the inside. You see what I mean? There is something really interesting and important about the role that imagination plays here. Yeah. Yep. So is that it? Are we all happy now with what functionalism is? Put up your hand if you think, I still just don't get it, what functionalism is. Put up your hand if you get it. If you don't get it, what it means to be functionalist about a notion like grumpy. Put up your hand if you're okay, 1, 2. Okay, put up your hand if you get it, what it means to be functionalist about a notion like grumpy. Boy, okay. Yes?
Do functionalists allow for variations of grumpiness?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. Those will be variations in what kind of outputs you get for any one given input. Yeah. Yep. Oh, sorry. I was just asking you. Do you want to pursue that? Oh, okay. Okay, I'm not quite sure how to proceed here. But, well, I don't know if this will help. Here's the abstract definition of a functional state. You define the functional state, the box in the middle there, by giving a big list of all the possible inputs to that state and a big list of all the outputs you get for each input and what state gives way to the central state there for any given input. Okay, so that abstract definition, that's perfectly clear. Yep. And then the idea is the very natural thing that anyone thinks is, well, of course, pain has a functional role like that. If you're in pain, then, well, what is pain? Pain is a state that is brought about by physical injury, that kind of thing. And then you get as output cries for help and so on. If you're in pain, then if you have as input sight of painkiller, then you will get as output taking the painkiller. So it's what about the idea that pain has a functional role? Put up your hand if that's perfectly clear. Aha. Okay, then I think the next step is easy. Pain has a functional role. Raise a question if that's not 100% clear. There are characteristic causes and effects of pain, and once you're in the state of pain, then you will respond in characteristic ways to given inputs. Yeah, everybody knows that. Yep. So, oh, right, okay. Okay. Right. Okay, but now it's easy, right? Pain has a characteristic yes?
So the first box, that's the input, and then pain, that's what comes from the input?
Yeah, I put this pretty clumsily. Pain is a state you go into, right? Then once you're in that state, there will be characteristic outputs you get for any input. So if you were previously in a non-pain state, yeah, and then you got as input a dividing of the flesh by a knife, yeah, then you would then go into the pain state, yeah, and you'd get as output yelling and so on. Yep, yeah. So it is a state you go into as a consequence of what happened earlier. And then once you're in the pain state, that will make a difference to how you respond to other kinds of input, like if you're offered aspirin, say. Yep. Does that make sense? Yep.
Can you go into multiple states at once from one input?
Yes. No reason why not. I mean, this is obviously simplifying things right down, yeah. But that kind of structure could be mimicked all over the whole system, yeah. And you can do this at different levels of grain too. So the idea that pain has a functional role, that's all right. Yes, we're 100% on board with that? Okay. So we characterize all these inputs and outputs, what intermediate states you go into. And then we say, that's all pain is. Well, there you are. That was easy. Yes? Aha, yes, right. Up until this point, right, you could say, okay, there's the sensation, right, that has the functional role. The hard thing, now follow me like a leopard. Follow me very closely here. There's a sensation, and the idea that I guess everybody is happy with at this point is the sensation has a functional role, right? But now the question is, what is it to have that sensation? That's the fundamental question we're addressing, right? What is it to have that sensation? And the answer is, there is no more to having that sensation than being in a state with this functional role. So it's like you start out with the idea of the sensation, build around the thing of the functional role, and then I say, and now when I tell you what the functional role is, there is nothing left to say about what the sensation intrinsically is. There is no such thing as what the sensation intrinsically is. There is only the functional role. Now, that maybe makes most sense. If I can just stick with this example of being grumpy, when we were having that bit of dialogue about the Spartans and grumpiness, if you start out thinking of grumpiness as a sensation, then you can do this kind of picture. And then I say, but look, if you got that functional role, that's all it is to be grumpy. And if you took away this functional role, which is what happened in the case of the Super Spartans, there wouldn't be any vestige of grumpiness left. The mood would have disappeared. So there is no more to the sensation than this functional role. And the functionalist says that's the general case. That's true of every psychological state. Okay? So it's just like this picture where the sensation has the functional role, except we drop out that bit and say the functional role just is the sensation. Being in a state with that functional role just is having the sensation. Now, you haven't really understood this unless you have that reaction like, hey, where did the sensation go? You see what I mean? You haven't really understood it unless you have that reaction. But first of all, you're likely to have that reaction to any attempt to identify what a psychological state is. Yeah, it's not like any rival view is going to do any better than that. And you see the motive for thinking of it like this. That's the only way you're going to make sense of the identity at all. Okay? Put up your hand if you see what functionalism is. Hey, result. Right. And if you think it can't possibly be true. Okay, I think that's quite a healthy reaction. Okay, good. Okay, well, here's Block. Here's Block giving his killer argument against functionalism, which is really just a way of trying to articulate that that can't be right. That where did the sensation go kind of reaction. Block was writing, I guess this is from the early 70s. I think the perception of China then must have been a little bit different to the perception of China now. Suppose we convert the government of China to functionalism. I don't know what he's thinking. But anyway, suppose we convert the government of China to functionalism and convince its officials that it would enormously enhance their international prestige to realize a human mind for an hour. I don't know. I mean, when you ask people what was going on in the early 70s, you usually get something about there were a lot of drugs around then or something. But anyway, suppose we do that. Okay, you convince them that we're going to realize a human mind for an hour. So then what you do is provide each of all these people in China with a specially designed two-way radio that connects them in the right way to other people and to an artificial body. So each person in this scenario is going to have a very simple book of rules to follow. So imagine you're the person realizing S1. So you're told, okay, if you're, actually when I said S1, let's make it S4. If you're in S4, the current state is S4, and you get the Y input. You just get Y coming in. You just get a Y coming in from someone else. Then what you do is you change the current state to S5, and you output L. Right? So that everyone's got a simple task like that. You're in S4, you get Y coming in, and then you output L. You could do that, right? And you just get a billion people all doing that kind of stuff. That's all right so far? Okay. Well, that system could be functionally identical to you. Suppose that each person there is mimicking one of your neurons, responding in the way that one of your neurons does to input signals from other neurons, outputting to other neurons the way that your neuron outputs to other neurons. Well, that whole system there could be just like you functionally. Yes? I mean, however complex your functional organization is, just get enough people in to mimic your functional organization. But does that whole system have thoughts, feelings, sensations? That seems absolutely crazy. Yeah, of course it doesn't. I mean, people sometimes say, look, the Apple Corporation is deeply hurt by these allegations, or something like that. But, you know, the Apple Corporation doesn't really feel pain. No, it doesn't feel pain. Not the way a human does. That whole thing there can't be having sensations. There can't be raw feels, immediate phenomenological properties, the pangs and itches, the throbs. That whole thing can't be having any of that. So it's got the same functional organization as you, but it doesn't feel pain at all. Yep. Therefore, functionalism must be false. Because that's got the right kind of box and arrow structure. It's got exactly the same box and arrow structure as you. But it doesn't have any psychological life. So pain can't be... This is a very simple argument. But it articulates that feeling. The sensations just vanished from functionalism. Yep. So that's that. We can end it there. Goodbye, functionalism. Yes? Is that completely convincing? You see what the argument is? Yeah? Okay. Actually, a student in this class a couple of years ago gave the best response I know to that argument. She said a functionalist can easily resist that. I'll come on to that in a second. But just to get the abstract structure here, we were saying this is the functional structure of pain, right? And the problem is that if you call this organization with 1 billion people in it, maybe hooked up to a robot, if you call that Blockhead, after its inventor, Block, yeah, then Blockhead has got the same functional structure as you, but doesn't feel pain. So the thing about variable realizability was this was going to explain how it could be that you can feel pain and an octopus can feel pain. Because talking about pain is a very abstract way of describing something physical. It describes it at this level of functional organization, so you can have different realizers. But the thing is that although this lets in the octopus as well as you, because you and the octopus can have the same functional structure, and so you can both count as having pain, it also lets in the whole population of China here. But on the other hand, there are kind of thought experiments that go the other way. This is one by the English philosopher Arnold Zuboff, who said, well, okay, you're used to the idea of a prosthetic limb, right? If you lost a toe and they said we can make a perfect metal replacement that works just as well, that would be great, right? If they said parts of your brain are wearing out, but our technology is now such that half a dozen key cells that you're losing, we can replace them with electronic gadgetry. That would be great, right? Would you go for that? We could replace this bit of your brain with some electrical set of transistors that do just the same work. You'd be crazy not to go for that. Yeah? And whatever you kind of feelings you had before, you'd have just the same once that bit of your brain had been replaced by electronic gadgetry. But all the electronic gadgetry has in common with your actual brain is its functional structure. It is wired up in the same way to all the other cells in your brain as the original cells were. That's all it can be, right? It's not made of the same stuff or anything. It doesn't have any kind of ghostly characteristics. It's just got the same functional structure as your brain cells. Well, now imagine that as the years go on, this keeps happening. You lose more and more brain cells. The technology keeps advancing. They keep saying, we can fill in more and more of this. Eventually you wind up with an entirely electronic brain that is functionally just like the original brain. It's going to feel to you just like it did at the start. Here's an objection a student gave just a couple of years ago here, which I think is devastating. I'm not aware of any. I don't know if the GSIs know of any. Tell me in a second if you know of any published version of this. I think it is publishable. Anyway, I highlight this partly to encourage you. If you could do it, you can do it. The objection here is very simple. The whole thing about Block's robot is that it contains 1 billion people, living, breathing, human people. So each of them is consenting for an hour to just pull the levers, pick up the radio in just the way that Block says. But does that whole thing really have the same functional structure as you? Well, of course not, because these are people. They might get bored. They might demand a raise. They might rebel against the government. They might overthrow the whole thing. You know perfectly well, your neurons can't do that. Your neurons are really dumb individually. Your neurons can't do anything but pull those levers and use those radios. So this scenario where you have Blockhead, what you've got is people there who are voluntarily for a moment mimicking your functional structure, but it doesn't at all have the same functional structure as a regular human. To get something that really had the same functional structure as a regular human, you'd have to actually replace each of these humans with something stupid. Either an actual biological cell or maybe a bit of metal that could only behave in that way. Didn't have any capacity for rebellion or doing anything else. And once you do that, you've just got either a kind of expanded version of your actual brain, which surely is going to be perfectly capable of having sensations, or else maybe a metal version of your human brain, which could equally well support sensations. So if you think about the neurons firing in the human brain, they don't have agreements. They can't withdraw their agreement to the whole situation. So Block's argument looks good, but there's a kind of sleight of hand in it, because it doesn't really have the same functional structure as that of the human brain. And it's only because it clearly has such a wildly different functional structure to the human brain that it seems so obvious that it doesn't have sensations. There's a lot more to say about blockhead, actually, but that's a first pass of why it doesn't seem like it can be right. I should say it's been a very influential argument. This has been influential to this day, but there seems to be this very simple problem with it. Yeah? So maybe it's true that if you've got that functional structure, you just must have sensations. You must have pains, and so on. That's plain as day? Yes?
What if you program the computer to have that kind of functional structure?
That's right, yeah.
Then how would you really couldn't tell if that computer was actually feeling the sensation of pain?
Wouldn't the computer be feeling the sensation of pain? I mean, isn't it a kind of, we talked a couple of classes ago about speciesism, where people say, well, octopuses can't really have feelings because they're so tentacly. Yeah? But similarly, people say, well, computers couldn't have feelings because they're cold, metallic, non-biological. Yeah? But that is, again, just a kind of prejudice. Is it not? I mean, if my brain got replaced bit by bit with metal, would you really say, oh, well, he doesn't feel pain? He's got one of those metal brains. He cries, he yells. If you cut him, he bleeds. But he doesn't feel pain. That would be a kind of prejudice. Right? I mean, this is Berkeley. We don't do that. Yeah. Isn't that right?
I disagree, but that could be.
You disagree about Berkeley, or?
I disagree about something metallic, something feeling anything. I don't know. I feel like if you program, there's a reason why you have these robotic structures and hand and things like that that don't
Right.
feel anything on something.
So we find a planet where the organic life forms are, if I can put it like that, made of metal. They reproduce and so on, but they're all actually made of metal. You think, no, they can't have feelings. They're made of metal. What?
I guess I just see a difference between a functional output versus a mental sensation.
But that's what we're arguing about, right? That's very clear. That just begs the question. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. The trouble is to articulate why that would be, and appealing to crude prejudices in favor of living organisms. If I can put it like that. That's not an argument, is it? Is that an argument? You might say calling it a crude prejudice isn't an argument against it, but put up your hand if you think a creature made of metal could feel pain. And if you're pretty clear it couldn't, and if you're not clear, okay, that's about evens, I would say. Okay. Okay. More on this on Monday when we look at this hypothesis of colours all the way around the other way.